The small voice on the other end of the phone cut through me like a knife, trembling with fear and confusion as my 8-year-old granddaughter Emma whispered words that would destroy everything I thought I knew about my family. "Grandpa," she said, her voice so quiet I had to strain to hear, "I have something to tell you about what Grandma made us say. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments." My name is Frank Mitchell, though the grandkids always called me Pappy, and I'm 68 years old. This is the story of how my ex-wife weaponized my own grandchildren against me, coaching them to lie about abuse that never happened in order to destroy my relationship with the kids I adored and increase her control over family finances. What started as a bitter divorce became a systematic campaign of manipulation that would cost me 5 years of my grandchildren's lives and nearly destroy my faith in human decency. But sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it, and sometimes children find the courage to speak up about the adults who have used them as weapons in wars they never should have been part of. The journey to that devastating phone call began 18 months earlier when my marriage of 32 years to Monica finally collapsed under the weight of resentment, financial disagreements, and fundamental incompatibility that we'd both ignored for far too long. Monica had always been controlling and manipulative, but I'd attributed those traits to her difficult childhood and assumed that love and patience would eventually soften her sharp edges. I'd been wrong about her capacity for change and dramatically underestimated her willingness to use any weapon available to get what she wanted in our divorce proceedings. Our divorce had been particularly ugly because of disputes over my construction business, which I'd built from nothing over 40 years, while Monica had focused on raising our 2 children and managing our household. She'd never shown interest in the business during our marriage, but she suddenly became fascinated with its value and her right to half of everything I'd worked to create. Her attorney, Janet Morrison, was known throughout the city as a ruthless advocate who specialized in extracting maximum settlements from wealthy husbands who'd underestimated their wives' determination to claim their fair share of marital assets. The business valuation alone had cost me $50,000 in expert fees and accounting analyses that revealed every detail of 40 years of financial records. Monica's team had hired their own experts who somehow determined that my construction company was worth nearly twice what my accountants had calculated, creating a dispute that required months of additional litigation and thousands more in legal fees. The process had been designed to exhaust my resources and patience, forcing me to accept settlement terms that were more generous than what Monica could have won through normal negotiations. But the business dispute was just the beginning of Monica's strategy to maximize her divorce settlement. She'd also claimed that I'd hidden assets in offshore accounts, requiring expensive forensic accounting investigations that found nothing because there was nothing to find. She demanded alimony that would have left me unable to maintain my own household, justifying her request by claiming that her contributions to our marriage had been undervalued and that she deserved compensation for sacrificing her own career to support mine. The most painful aspect of the divorce proceedings was watching Monica systematically rewrite the history of our marriage to support her financial claims. According to her testimony, I'd been controlling and emotionally abusive throughout our relationship, preventing her from pursuing her own interests while demanding that she sacrifice her ambitions for my business success. She claimed that I'd isolated her from friends and family, managed all our finances without her input, and treated her like an employee rather than a partner in our marriage. These allegations were so contrary to my memory of our relationship that I'd initially assumed Monica's attorney had encouraged her to exaggerate our marital problems to strengthen her case for higher alimony and property division. I'd provided financial security and encouraged her involvement in community activities, charitable organizations, and social groups that had enriched her life and expanded her network of friendships. But according to Monica's version of events, every decision we'd made together had been dictated by my controlling personality and selfish priorities. The most devastating part of her testimony concerned my relationship with our grandchildren Emma and Jake, the children of our son Michael and daughter-in-law Sarah. Monica claimed that I'd been inappropriately involved in their upbringing, insisting on spending too much time with them, and undermining their parents' authority through excessive gifts and indulgent behavior. She suggested that my relationship with Emma and Jake was unhealthy, and that she'd been concerned about my influence on their development for several years. At the time, I dismissed these concerns as desperate attempts to generate sympathy for Monica's financial demands by portraying me as someone whose character flaws justified punitive alimony and property division. Emma and Jake were the light of my retirement years, bringing joy and purpose to my life after stepping back from active management of my construction business. They spent weekends at my house, joined me on fishing trips and camping adventures, and provided the kind of unconditional love that only grandchildren can offer to grandparents who have time to focus entirely on their happiness and development. The final divorce decree awarded Monica half of our marital assets, including a substantial portion of my business value, plus monthly alimony payments that would continue until her death or remarriage. The settlement had been expensive but not devastating, leaving me with enough resources to maintain my lifestyle and continue providing generous support for Emma and Jake's activities and education. I'd assumed that our family relationships would gradually heal from the damage caused by our contentious divorce, and that Monica and I would eventually find ways to cooperate as grandparents, even if we couldn't remain married to each other. But Monica's apparent acceptance of the divorce settlement and her initial cooperation with custody arrangements for Emma and Jake had been strategic deception designed to lull me into false security while she prepared for the next phase of her campaign against me. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, she began implementing a plan that would use my beloved grandchildren as weapons to destroy my reputation, eliminate my access to them, and generate additional income through increased support obligations. The first sign of trouble came when Emma and Jake started behaving differently during their weekend visits with me. They seemed nervous and distracted, less interested in activities they'd always enjoyed, and reluctant to discuss what was happening at home or school. Emma, who'd always been chatty and affectionate, became quiet and withdrawn, often sitting apart from me during movie nights instead of cuddling on the couch as she'd done since she was a toddler. Jake, who was 10 years old and had always been enthusiastic about learning construction skills and helping with projects around my house, suddenly seemed uncomfortable in my workshop and reluctant to spend time alone with me. When I asked about his changed behavior, he gave vague answers about being tired or worried about school, but his explanations didn't match the anxiety I could see in his expressions and body language. I'd initially attributed their behavioral changes to normal adjustment difficulties following their grandparents' divorce, assuming that Emma and Jake were processing confusion and sadness about our family's upheaval. Children often react to adult conflicts with regression, anxiety, and behavioral changes that reflect their uncertainty about relationships and security. I'd planned to give them extra patience and attention while they worked through whatever emotions they were experiencing. But the children's behavior wasn't improving with time and patience. If anything, They seemed to be growing more uncomfortable during visits, jumping nervously when I entered rooms unexpectedly, and avoiding physical contact that had once been natural and affectionate. Emma stopped asking me to read bedtime stories when she stayed overnight, and Jake declined invitations to work on model airplane projects that had been our shared passion for years. Their parents, Michael and Sarah, seemed unaware of any problems when I questioned them about the children's changed behavior. They reported that Emma and Jake were doing fine at home and school, participating in their usual activities, and maintaining their normal relationships with friends and teachers. The disconnect between their behavior during my visits and their apparent normalcy in other settings was puzzling and increasingly concerning. 3 months after I'd first noticed the changes in Emma and Jake's behavior, Monica requested a meeting to discuss concerns about the children's well-being that had supposedly come to her attention through conversations with their parents and teachers. We met at a neutral restaurant downtown, where Monica's demeanor was serious and somewhat accusatory, as she described problems she claimed to have observed in Emma and Jake's behavior after their weekend visits with me. According to Monica, the children had been experiencing nightmares, bedwetting, and anxiety symptoms that seemed to correlate with their time spent at my house. She claimed that Emma had become fearful of older men in general, and that Jake had developed behavioral problems at school that required intervention from counselors and administrators. She suggested that something was happening during their visits with me that was causing psychological distress, though she was careful not to make direct accusations that could be challenged or investigated. "Frank," Monica said, her voice carrying the concerned tone of a grandmother genuinely worried about her grandchildren's welfare, "I think we need to consider whether these overnight visits are appropriate for children this age. Emma and Jake seem to be struggling with something, and the timing suggests it's related to their weekends with you." The suggestion that my relationship with Emma and Jake was causing them psychological harm was so contrary to everything I believed about our bond that I'd initially dismissed it as another of Monica's attempts to create problems where none existed. The children had always been happy and comfortable during their visits, and their supposed symptoms of distress weren't evident during our time together. If anything, they seemed more relaxed and natural at my house than they'd appeared during recent visits. But Monica's concerns weren't presented as accusations that could be directly challenged or disproven. She was simply observing behavioral patterns and suggesting possible explanations, leaving room for other interpretations while planting seeds of doubt about my fitness as a caregiver for young children. Her approach was sophisticated and calculated, designed to create suspicion, without making claims that could expose her to legal liability if proven false. "Maybe we should reduce the overnight visits temporarily," Monica suggested, "just until we can figure out what's causing these behavioral changes. The children's well-being has to be our first priority, and if something about their routine is creating problems, we need to address it immediately." The request seemed reasonable on the surface, reflecting appropriate concern for children who might be experiencing difficulties that required adult intervention. But I recognized it as the first step in a campaign to restrict my access to Emma and Jake, using their supposed behavioral problems as justification for reducing their time with me. Monica was positioning herself as their protector while portraying me as a potential threat to their psychological well-being. I agreed to temporary restrictions on overnight visits while we investigated the children's behavioral changes, hoping that professional evaluation would reveal the true causes of whatever problems they might be experiencing. If Emma and Jake were struggling with anxiety or other emotional difficulties, I wanted them to receive appropriate help regardless of whether those problems were related to their visits with me. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a child psychologist recommended by Emma and Jake's pediatrician, conducted comprehensive evaluations of both children to assess their emotional state and identify possible sources of stress or trauma in their lives. The evaluation process included individual interviews with Emma and Jake, psychological testing designed to reveal hidden emotional conflicts, and consultations with their parents, teachers, and other adults who interacted with them regularly. Dr. Martinez's initial findings were confusing and concerning. Emma and Jake showed signs of anxiety and hypervigilance that suggested they'd experienced or witnessed something troubling, but they were reluctant to discuss specific incidents or identify particular sources of their distress. When questioned about their relationship with me, they gave conflicting answers that alternated between expressing love and affection and hinting at undefined discomfort or fear. The children seemed to be experiencing some form of psychological conflict, Dr. Martinez explained during a meeting to discuss her preliminary findings. They appear to care about their grandfather, but also seem anxious about something related to their visits with him. This kind of ambivalence often indicates that children are processing conflicting messages or experiences that they don't fully understand. The assessment suggested that Emma and Jake were indeed struggling with emotional difficulties related to our relationship, but it didn't identify specific causes or recommend particular interventions. Dr. Martinez recommended continued therapy to help the children process whatever experiences were creating their internal conflict, while also suggesting that visits with me be supervised until the source of their distress could be identified and addressed. Supervised visitation felt like punishment for crimes I hadn't committed, but I agreed to whatever restrictions were necessary to ensure Emma and Jake's emotional well-being. If professional supervision would help them feel more comfortable and secure during our visits, I was willing to accept the inconvenience and implicit suggestion that I might pose some kind of threat to children. I'd never do anything to harm. The supervised visits took place at Dr. Martinez's office, where trained observers monitored my interactions with Emma and Jake while they played, talked, or engaged in activities designed to reveal the nature of our relationship. The artificial setting and constant observation made normal interaction difficult, but I was determined to demonstrate that I was a loving and appropriate grandfather who posed no threat to the children's safety or well-being. During these supervised sessions, Emma and Jake's behavior was even more confusing than it had been during our private visits. They seemed torn between their natural affection for me and some undefined anxiety that made them reluctant to fully engage in conversation or activities. They would approach me enthusiastically and then suddenly withdraw, as if they'd remembered something that made them question their instinctive desire for closeness and connection. Dr. Martinez observed these interactions carefully, taking notes and occasionally asking gentle questions designed to understand the children's internal experience. But Emma and Jake's responses were guarded and sometimes contradictory, suggesting they were struggling with emotions or memories they couldn't easily articulate or explain. After 6 weeks of supervised visitation, Dr. Martinez scheduled a meeting to discuss her observations and recommendations. Her assessment was troubling but inconclusive, identifying clear signs of distress in Emma and Jake while failing to pinpoint specific causes or solutions. The children were obviously struggling with something related to our relationship, but the nature of their difficulties remained unclear. I'm concerned about some behavioral indicators that suggest the children may have experienced inappropriate contact, Dr. Martinez said, her words hitting me like physical blows. They demonstrate hypervigilance around adult men, show knowledge of sexual concepts that would be unusual for their age, and exhibit anxiety responses that are consistent with trauma experienced by children who have been sexually abused. The suggestion that Emma and Jake had been sexually abused was so shocking and horrifying that I couldn't initially process what Dr. Martinez was telling me. These were children I loved more than my own life, children I would die to protect from any form of harm or exploitation. The idea that someone had hurt them in such a fundamental way was devastating enough without the implication that I might be the perpetrator. "Dr. Martinez," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, "I've never done anything inappropriate with Emma and Jake. I love them completely, and I would never harm them in any way. If someone has abused them, it wasn't me, and I want to help find out who's responsible and ensure they're protected." Dr. Martinez's expression was professionally neutral but sympathetic as she continued explaining her observations and concerns. "I'm not making accusations, Mr. Mitchell," she said, "but I have a professional obligation to report suspected child abuse to appropriate authorities. The children will need specialized therapy regardless of who's responsible, and they'll need protection from any ongoing threats to their safety." The Child Protective Services investigation that followed was the most humiliating and terrifying experience of my life. Social worker Patricia Williams interviewed me for hours about my relationship with Emma and Jake, my activities during their visits, and any possible explanations for their behavioral changes and apparent trauma symptoms. She was professional but clearly suspicious, treating me like someone who was probably guilty of horrific crimes against children I adored. The investigation included interviews with Emma and Jake, conducted by specialists trained to question child abuse victims, without traumatizing them further or implanting false memories through suggestive questioning techniques. The children were interviewed separately and repeatedly, using age-appropriate methods designed to elicit honest accounts of their experiences while protecting them from additional psychological harm. But the investigation also revealed disturbing inconsistencies in Emma and Jake's accounts of their supposed abuse. Their descriptions of inappropriate incidents were detailed enough to be concerning, but vague enough to prevent verification or disproof. They claimed that inappropriate touching had occurred during bedtime routines and bath time, but their accounts of timing and circumstances didn't match the reality of our visits together. More troubling was the discovery that Emma and Jake's knowledge of sexual concepts and terminology seemed rehearsed rather than based on actual experience. They used words and phrases that children their age wouldn't naturally know, but they used them in contexts that suggested incomplete understanding of their meaning. Their accounts sounded like stories they'd been taught rather than memories they genuinely experienced. Detective Robert Thompson, who specialized in child abuse investigations, spent weeks reviewing evidence and interviewing witnesses in an attempt to determine whether criminal charges were warranted. He was thorough and professional, but his investigation was complicated by the lack of physical evidence and the inconsistencies in Emma and Jake's statements about when and where the alleged abuse had occurred. "Look, Frank," Detective Thompson said during one of our interviews, "something's not right here. The kids' stories don't add up in terms of timing and opportunity, but they know things and use language that suggests someone's been coaching them. If you didn't abuse them, then someone taught them to say you did, which is almost as serious as the original allegations." The investigation dragged on for months while I lived under a cloud of suspicion that destroyed my reputation in the community and eliminated most of my social connections. Friends who'd known me for decades struggled to reconcile the abuse allegations with their personal experience of my character, but they couldn't risk maintaining relationships with someone who might be a child molester. Even people who believed in my innocence found it easier to distance themselves than to navigate the awkward social dynamics of defending someone accused of such serious crimes. My construction business, which I'd built over 40 years, began losing contracts as word spread about the investigation. Clients who trusted me to work around their homes and families suddenly became uncomfortable with my presence, even though the allegations involved my grandchildren rather than customers or their children. The financial impact was devastating but secondary to the personal pain of watching relationships and professional reputation disappear based on accusations I couldn't effectively defend against. 8 months after the investigation began, the district attorney's office announced that criminal charges wouldn't be filed due to insufficient evidence and concerns about the reliability of the children's testimony. The decision was based on legal standards rather than a determination of my innocence, leaving me in limbo where I wasn't officially guilty, but also wasn't clearly vindicated. The inconsistencies in the children's statements and the lack of corroborating evidence make prosecution unlikely to succeed. District Attorney Jennifer Walsh explained during a brief meeting to inform me of her decision. However, this doesn't mean the allegations are false, and Child Protective Services will continue to monitor the situation to ensure the children's safety. But Monica wasn't satisfied with the inconclusive outcome of the criminal investigation. 2 weeks after the DA announced that charges wouldn't be filed, she petitioned the family court for emergency modification of the custody order, seeking to terminate my visitation rights permanently based on the same allegations that hadn't supported criminal prosecution. Her attorney, Janet Morrison, argued that family court had a lower burden of proof than criminal court, and that the children's safety required protection even when criminal guilt couldn't be proven beyond reasonable doubt. She presented the same evidence that had been insufficient for prosecution as compelling reasons why I should never be allowed unsupervised contact with Emma and Jake again. Your Honor, Janet Morrison argued during the emergency hearing, these children have suffered enough. They've been traumatized by experiences they're too young to fully understand, and they deserve protection from further harm. The criminal justice system's failure to prosecute doesn't mean these children are safe, and it certainly doesn't mean they should be forced to continue visiting someone who may have abused them. The family court hearing was a nightmare that combined the worst aspects of the criminal investigation with the emotional devastation of watching Emma and Jake testify against me in a formal legal proceeding. They were brought into the courtroom by victim advocates and seated at a special table designed to make child witnesses feel more comfortable, but nothing could disguise the fact that they were accusing their beloved grandfather of sexual abuse. Emma's testimony was delivered in a small, shaky voice that broke my heart even as her words destroyed any hope of maintaining our relationship. She described bedtime incidents that had allegedly occurred during overnight visits, using terminology that seemed far too sophisticated for an 8-year-old child, but was presented with enough conviction to be compelling to a judge who had no choice but to take such allegations seriously. He would come into my room after I was supposed to be asleep, Emma said, her words barely audible but captured by the court recording system that would preserve her testimony forever. He would sit on my bed and touch me in places that felt wrong, but he said it was our special secret, and I shouldn't tell anyone because they wouldn't understand. Jake's testimony was even more detailed and disturbing, describing supposed abuse scenarios that would have required planning and premeditation on my part. He claimed that I'd gradually escalated inappropriate behavior over several months, beginning with seemingly innocent contact and progressing to more serious violations of his physical boundaries. At first it seemed normal, Jake testified, his 10-year-old voice carrying a maturity that seemed unnatural for his age. Pappy would help me get ready for bed, and sometimes he would give me back rubs or help me put on my pajamas. But then he started touching me in ways that made me uncomfortable, and he told me it was normal for grandfathers and grandsons to have special relationships that other people wouldn't understand. The testimony was devastating in its specificity and consistency, creating a narrative that explained the children's behavioral changes while portraying me as a predator who'd systematically groomed and abused them over an extended period. The fact that their stories corroborated each other made them more credible, even though I knew with absolute certainty that none of the described incidents had ever occurred. Judge Patricia Williams had no choice but to grant Monica's petition for custody modification, immediately terminating my visitation rights and ordering that I have no contact with Emma and Jake, pending further investigation and evaluation. The children were placed under Monica's protection, with additional support services designed to help them recover from the trauma they'd allegedly experienced. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Williams said, her voice carrying the formal authority required for such serious matters, "while the criminal charges have not been filed, this court's primary responsibility is to protect the welfare of minor children. Based on the testimony we've heard today, I'm granting the emergency custody modification and ordering that you have no contact with Emma and Jake until such time as their safety can be assured." The gavel's impact echoed through the courtroom like a death sentence, officially ending my relationship with the grandchildren who'd been the center of my retirement years. Emma and Jake were led out of the courtroom by victim advocates, probably believing they'd done something brave and necessary by testifying against someone who'd hurt them. They had no way of knowing that their testimony was based on coached lies rather than genuine memories. That evening, I sat in my empty house surrounded by photographs and mementos from 5 years of being Pappy to children who now viewed me as their abuser. Pictures from birthday parties, fishing trips, camping adventures, and quiet afternoons reading books together. Evidence of a relationship built on love and trust that had been systematically destroyed by lies I couldn't defend against or disprove. The financial implications of the custody change became clear when Monica immediately filed for increased alimony and child support, arguing that she now bore full responsibility for caring for traumatized children who required extensive therapy and specialized services. Her monthly expenses had supposedly increased dramatically since she'd become their primary protector, requiring additional support from me to ensure their recovery and well-being. My client's financial needs have increased substantially since she became the sole caregiver for these traumatized children, Janet Morrison argued during the support modification hearing. Emma and Jake require specialized therapy, increased supervision, and additional security measures that represent significant financial burdens. Mr. Mitchell should bear responsibility for these costs, given that his alleged actions created the need for these services. The monthly support payments I was ordered to make nearly tripled from their previous amounts, reflecting Monica's increased expenses for caring for children who could no longer safely visit their grandfather. The irony was bitter. I was paying significantly more money to support children I was forbidden to see, funding their recovery from trauma I'd never inflicted while being denied any role in their lives or healing process. But the financial burden was insignificant compared to the emotional devastation of losing Emma and Jake during what should have been some of our best years together. They were at perfect ages for sharing adventures and creating memories that would last their entire lives. Instead, they were in therapy processing supposed trauma while I was isolated and vilified by a community that assumed the worst about my character and conduct. The social isolation was almost unbearable. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid encountering someone they believed was a child molester. Former friends from church and community organizations withdrew from relationships they'd valued for decades, unable to reconcile their personal knowledge of my character with the horrific allegations that had been made public through legal proceedings. Dr. Martinez had recommended that I seek therapy to address my own psychological response to the allegations and their impact on my mental health. The therapist she referred me to, Dr. James Morrison, specialized in working with adults who'd been falsely accused of child abuse, a population that was larger than most people realized, and that faced unique challenges in defending their innocence and rebuilding their lives. False allegations of child abuse are particularly devastating because they can't be definitively disproven, Dr. Morrison explained during one of our early sessions. You can't prove a negative, and the mere fact that children made these accusations creates suspicion that follows you regardless of legal outcomes. Recovery requires accepting that some people will always doubt your innocence, while focusing on relationships with people who know your true character. The therapy helped me develop coping strategies for dealing with social isolation and community suspicion, but it couldn't address the fundamental problem of being separated from grandchildren I loved desperately. Every day brought reminders of activities we'd planned, holidays we'd celebrated, and future adventures that would never happen because of lies I couldn't expose or contradict. A year passed with no contact from Emma and Jake, no birthday cards or holiday calls, no updates about their school performance or recovery progress. I learned about their lives secondhand through mutual acquaintances who occasionally mentioned seeing Monica at community events, always describing her as a devoted grandmother who was protecting vulnerable children from someone who'd betrayed their trust in the most fundamental way possible. But 18 months after the custody change, I began receiving strange phone calls from numbers I didn't recognize, calls where the caller would remain silent for several seconds before hanging up without speaking. The calls came at different times of day and night, suggesting they weren't random telemarketing or accidental misdials. Someone was deliberately calling me but not speaking, creating a pattern that seemed both intentional and mysterious. The anonymous calls continued for several weeks before I finally answered one, where the caller remained on the line long enough for me to hear background sounds that suggested the presence of children. There were whispered conversations, and what sounded like electronic games or television programs that might be playing in a child's room or play area. The caller was definitely calling from an environment where children were present. "Hello," I said during one of these calls, hoping to encourage whoever was calling to finally speak or identify themselves. "Is someone there? If you need help, please tell me what's wrong." The call ended immediately, as usual, but something about the background sounds and the timing of the hang-up suggested that a child had been on the other end of the line. The calls were coming from someone too young to sustain adult conversation, but old enough to operate telephone equipment and dial numbers from memory or written records. 3 weeks later, I received the call that would change everything. Emma's small voice came through clearly, though she was obviously nervous and frightened about making contact she'd been forbidden to initiate. "Pappy," she whispered, using the name she'd called me since she was 2 years old. "Is this really you?" The sound of her voice saying my grandfather's name was overwhelming, bringing tears to my eyes and hope to my heart for the first time since the custody hearing had ended our relationship. But I was also terrified that the call might be discovered and might create additional problems for Emma or legal complications for me. "Yes, sweetheart, it's really me," I replied, keeping my voice as gentle and reassuring as possible. Are you okay? Are you safe? How did you get my phone number? Emma's explanation was both heartbreaking and revealing. She and Jake had been secretly struggling with guilt and confusion about their testimony against me, remembering genuine experiences that contradicted the stories they'd told in court. They'd begun questioning Monica about inconsistencies between their actual memories and the abuse scenarios she'd coached them to describe. Grandma got really angry when we asked about things that didn't make sense, Emma whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of a child who discovered that adults she trusted had lied to her. She said we were getting confused and that we needed to stop thinking about you because it would make us sick again. But Jake and I remember good things, not bad things, and we don't understand why everyone says you hurt us when we remember feeling safe and happy. The conversation lasted only a few minutes before Emma became too frightened to continue, but she promised to call again when she could do so safely. She and Jake had been hiding their doubts and questions from Monica, who became angry and threatening whenever they expressed confusion about their supposed abuse or mentioned positive memories of time spent with me. Grandma says we have special sickness that makes us remember things wrong, Emma continued, and that we need to trust grown-ups instead of our own minds. But our minds remember you being nice to us, and we don't feel sick when we think about good times we had together. The revelation that Monica had been actively discouraging Emma and Jake from trusting their own memories was evidence of ongoing psychological manipulation, designed to maintain false narratives that served her purposes. She was teaching them to doubt their own perceptions and experiences, creating dependency on her version of events rather than allowing them to process their genuine feelings and recollections. Over the following weeks, Emma called several more times, always briefly and secretively, sharing additional details about Monica's coaching and the pressure she and Jake were under to maintain their stories about abuse that had never occurred. The children were beginning to understand that they'd been manipulated into lying, but they were also terrified of the consequences of admitting the truth. Jake wants to call you too, but he's scared that Grandma will find out and punish us, Emma explained during one of her calls. She said that if we ever tried to contact you, or if we told anyone that our stories weren't true, terrible things would happen to our family, and it would be our fault for being stupid and ungrateful. The threats Monica was using to maintain the children's silence were psychologically sophisticated and emotionally devastating. She was making Emma and Jake responsible for protecting their family, while simultaneously making them feel guilty about their natural desire to reconnect with someone they genuinely loved and trusted. The burden she was placing on young children was unconscionable. But Emma's courage in reaching out despite Monica's threats was also evidence that children have an innate sense of truth and justice that survives even systematic attempts to distort their understanding of reality. She knew something was wrong with the situation Monica had created, and she was brave enough to seek connection with someone she remembered as loving and safe. The breakthrough came 2 months later when Jake finally found the courage to join one of Emma's secret phone calls. His voice was shaky with emotion as he apologized for the lies he'd told and expressed confusion about why Monica had wanted them to hurt someone they loved. "Pappy, we're sorry we said those bad things about you," Jake said, his 10-year-old voice breaking with the weight of guilt he'd been carrying for months. "Grandma taught us what to say, and she said it was important for our family, but we knew it wasn't true. We knew you never hurt us, but we were scared not to do what she wanted." Jake's admission was simultaneously vindicating and heartbreaking. My innocence was finally being acknowledged by the children whose testimony had destroyed my reputation and relationships. But the cost of that vindication was the knowledge that Emma and Jake had been psychologically abused by someone who was supposed to protect them from harm. The children explained that Monica had spent months coaching them to believe and repeat stories about inappropriate behavior that had never occurred. She'd used a combination of rewards and threats to ensure their compliance, promising special privileges for remembering details correctly, while threatening terrible consequences if they ever revealed the truth about their coaching sessions. She would practice with us every day, Emma said, making us repeat the stories until we could say them without making mistakes. She said we were protecting our family from someone dangerous, but she also said we could never tell anyone about the practice sessions or the whole plan would be ruined. The systematic nature of Monica's manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty and sophistication. She'd essentially brainwashed young children into believing false memories, while simultaneously making them responsible for maintaining lies that served her financial and emotional needs. The psychological damage she'd inflicted on Emma and Jake was probably more severe than any harm the falsely alleged abuse could have caused. But the children's courage in finally telling the truth also created an opportunity for justice and healing that wouldn't have been possible if they'd remained silent forever. Dr. Martinez had explained that children who recant abuse allegations face intense scrutiny and pressure to return to their original stories. But Emma and Jake's consistency in admitting their lies suggested they were finally ready to trust their own memories and experiences. The legal process of overturning false abuse allegations was complex and emotionally challenging for everyone involved. Emma and Jake had to be interviewed again by specialists who needed to determine whether their recantation was genuine or whether they were being pressured to lie about their original testimony. The children's psychological well-being required careful protection throughout the investigation process. Dr. Martinez conducted extensive evaluations of Emma and Jake to assess their credibility and mental state, comparing their current statements with their original allegations to identify patterns that might reveal the truth about their experiences. The children's relief at finally being able to express their genuine feelings and memories was obvious, but they were also frightened about potential consequences of admitting they'd been coached to lie. The children demonstrate classic signs of having been manipulated by a trusted adult, Dr. Martinez reported after completing her evaluation. Their original testimony showed evidence of coaching, while their current statements are consistent with natural childhood memory and expression patterns. They appear to be telling the truth about having been taught to lie, and they're experiencing genuine guilt about the harm their false testimony caused. Detective Thompson reopened his investigation based on Emma and Jake's recantation, this time focusing on Monica's role in coaching the children rather than on alleged abuse by me. The evidence of witness tampering and filing false reports was substantial, including recorded therapy sessions, where the children's coached responses were clearly distinguishable from spontaneous childhood communication. But perhaps the most compelling evidence came from Emma and Jake themselves, who were finally able to describe the coaching process they'd experienced and the pressure they'd felt to maintain stories they knew weren't true. Their detailed accounts of Monica's manipulation tactics provided insight into how false allegations could be systematically created and maintained, even when they contradicted children's genuine experiences. She would get really angry if we forgot parts of the stories, or if we said something different from what she taught us, Jake explained during one of his interviews with Detective Thompson. She said forgetting meant we didn't care about our family, and that we were being selfish and stupid. But the stories never felt real, because we remembered good things instead of bad things. Monica was arrested 6 weeks later on charges that included filing false reports, witness tampering, child endangerment, and fraud related to her increased support payments that had been based on fabricated abuse allegations. Her lawyer attempted to argue that she genuinely believed the children had been abused and that her actions were motivated by protective instincts rather than financial greed. But the evidence of systematic coaching and manipulation was overwhelming. Recorded therapy sessions, financial records showing her increased income from modified support orders, and testimony from Emma and Jake about the pressure they'd experienced to maintain false stories created a compelling case for prosecution. Monica's protective grandmother facade couldn't survive scrutiny of her actual conduct and motivations. The criminal trial was covered extensively by local media, creating the kind of public attention that finally allowed me to present my side of the story and demonstrate my innocence to a community that had assumed the worst about my character. Emma and Jake's courage in testifying about Monica's manipulation helped other people understand how false allegations could be created and maintained by adults willing to use children as weapons in personal conflicts. Monica was ultimately convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 4 years in prison plus restitution for the financial losses I'd suffered due to her false allegations. The sentence was lighter than I'd hoped, but heavier than her attorney had expected, reflecting the court's recognition that her crimes had caused serious harm to both me and the children she'd manipulated. But prison time for Monica couldn't repair all the damage she'd caused or restore all the relationships that had been destroyed by her lies. Emma and Jake required extensive therapy to recover from the psychological manipulation they'd experienced, while I needed time to rebuild trust and reconnection with grandchildren who'd been taught to fear and distrust someone they'd once loved unconditionally. The reunification process was gradual and carefully supervised by therapists who specialized in helping families recover from trauma caused by false abuse allegations. Emma and Jake were initially hesitant about physical contact and overnight visits, not because they feared me, but because they'd been conditioned to associate such interactions with the false abuse scenarios Monica had coached them to describe. "I know you never hurt us," Emma said during one of our early reunification sessions, "but sometimes when you hug me, I remember the bad stories Grandma made us practice, and it feels confusing even though I know those stories weren't real." Her honest expression of internal conflict helped Dr. Martinez design therapeutic interventions that would help her separate false memories from genuine experiences. Jake's recovery was complicated by guilt about the damage his testimony had caused to my reputation and relationships. At 12 years old, he was beginning to understand the broader implications of Monica's manipulation and the harm that false allegations could cause to innocent people. His sense of responsibility for consequences he'd been too young to foresee or prevent required therapeutic attention to help him process his experiences appropriately. "I keep thinking about all the people who stopped being friends with you because of what we said," Jake told me during one of our sessions. "I wish I'd been brave enough to tell the truth sooner, but I was scared of what Grandma would do to us if we didn't cooperate with her plan." His regret was heartbreaking, but also evidence of his developing moral awareness and empathy for others. The therapy continued for over a year as we slowly rebuilt relationships that had been damaged by Monica's systematic lies and manipulation. Emma and Jake gradually regained confidence in their own memories and perceptions, while learning to trust adult authority figures who genuinely had their best interests at heart. The process was slow, but ultimately successful in restoring our family bonds. 3 years after Monica's conviction, Emma and Jake have largely recovered from their traumatic experiences and rebuilt strong relationships with me. They occasionally struggle with residual anxiety about adult authority and sometimes question their own memories when faced with conflicting information, but they've developed healthy skepticism and self-advocacy skills that will protect them from future manipulation. I'm never going to let another adult tell me what to think or feel about people I love, Emma declared recently, demonstrating the strength and wisdom she'd gained through surviving Monica's abuse. I know the difference between what's real and what's made up, and I trust my own heart about who's safe and who's dangerous. Jake has channeled his experience into advocacy for other children who might face similar manipulation, volunteering with organizations that educate families about the signs and dangers of coaching children to make false allegations. His work helps other kids understand that they don't have to lie for adults, and that truth-telling is always the right choice, even when it seems scary or difficult. I want other kids to know they can trust their own feelings and memories, Jake says, and that adults who really love them would never ask them to lie or hurt other people. If a grown-up wants you to make up stories about someone else, that's a sign that the grown-up is the one doing something wrong. Monica served 3 years in prison and was released on supervised probation, with restrictions that prevent her from having unsupervised contact with minor children. She's never apologized for the damage she caused or acknowledged the harm her actions inflicted on Emma, Jake, and me. Her continued denial suggests she still believes her manipulation was justified by whatever benefits she gained from the false allegations. But her lack of remorse is ultimately irrelevant to our family's healing and recovery. Emma and Jake have learned that they survived something terrible and emerged stronger, wiser, and more capable of protecting themselves and others from similar harm. They understand that love and truth are more powerful than manipulation and lies, and they've seen evidence that justice eventually prevails even when it takes longer than anyone would prefer. The relationship we've rebuilt is stronger than what we had before Monica's manipulation, forged through adversity, and based on mutual respect for the courage and integrity we've all demonstrated. Emma and Jake know they can trust their grandfather completely, while I know they have the strength to resist any future attempts to use them as weapons against people they love. Some damage can never be fully repaired, and some lost time can never be recovered. But children are resilient, truth has power, and love survives even the most calculated attempts to destroy it. Monica's manipulation temporarily separated us and caused tremendous pain, but it ultimately failed to achieve its goal of permanently destroying relationships built on genuine caring and mutual respect. If you like this story, please like this video. Subscribe to the channel and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.